Hello, everybody. Hello. All right, this is for AGNR 123 and probably 121. We're going to talk about soil mixes, and things like that. So let's get started. So earlier in the semester, we talked about edaphic factors, EDAPHIC, EDAPHIC factors. Those are the things that the soil, those are the characteristics of the soil that affect plant growth. So we're going to recap and talk about those first. So some of the things that the soil controls for plant growth. One is the texture. So the texture of the soil determines a couple of things. It determines how much water the soil holds. So for example, sandy soil, which has a coarse texture, has larger holes between the particles of sand. Therefore, water moves through that soil fairly quickly, and that soil doesn't hold on to much water because it's flowing through those pores. Likewise, that soil, that same sandy soil with those large pore sizes, holds a lot of air. So that soil dries out quickly. The other thing about well draining soil is all the nutrients that are available to the plants are in the water in the soil. So if the water is moving quickly through that soil, so are the nutrients. So in sandy soil, you fertilize a lot more than you would in, let's say, clay soil or silty soil because it's more well drained. So texture is really important. Again, the smaller the sizes of the soil, the particles of the soil, the smaller the holes between the soil, the spaces between the soil, the negative space, and water moves through differently. For example, clay, which has very, very small spaces between the soil, holds on to water very well. And it also doesn't have a lot of air in it. So it's the type of soil that you can overwater quite easily in clay soil because it can basically you could fill up all those holes, all those spaces, and the plant won't have any oxygen to the roots, and can die. So again, one of the first things we're going to talk about and look at, especially in lab, is texture. Really, really important. When we make our soil mixes, we're looking to create a texture that's light and airy, because air is good for plant roots, but at the same time, somewhat spongy to hold water and nutrients. All right, the other main thing we're thinking about our soil, edaphic factors, is in the ground. Typically, we have rocks and other things that provide minerals and change the chemistry of the soil. So, soil chemistry, the parent material, what the soil is made of, where it comes from, is very important. And that can vary depending on the rocks and the climate where that soil is being formed. For example, soils rich in organic matter that come from wet climates tend to be acidic, whereas in California, Southern California particularly, especially in some desert or inland areas, the soil can be alkaline and be high in mineral salts. Again, that has to do with the climate and also parent materials. So get your soil tested. So for your beginning horticulturists, that's what this class is for, our beginning horticulturists. If you really want to know about your soil, you can buy a soil test kit. It will give you pH, maybe your nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, some other things. But I would recommend spending the money. It's going to cost about $100 or so to get a actual soil test from an agricultural company. You send in your soil sample and do that. So you really want to do that. We talked about that. So always start with the good soil test. All right, but this lab coming that you're going to be doing tomorrow, or sorry, not tomorrow, if you're watching this to that day, later today, excuse me, we're going to be building soil, making soil. So we're going to talk about soils that are made by people. We've already spoken earlier in the semester about soils in the ground, and I did add a video to your module on rock types in soil. But the focus of this is to talk mostly about um, soil in pots, right? What do we do in containers? How do we make our soil in containers and things like that? So it's very important to think about that because we don't always have plants in the ground, um, right? They're not always going to be there in the ground with the edaphic factors of that local soil creating conditions. For example, a plant in a pot or doesn't have a connection to the parent material or the rocks or things like that. So that's something to think about. So this first part of the video, the edaphic factors, remember, are soil chemistry, pH, and texture. Okay, those things are things we worry about in the ground. All right, so let's talk about some things in the soil. Sorry, talk about making soil. So, like I mentioned before, plants in containers, plants out of the ground. You're going to need several things. They're going to need to have a component that drains well, that allows the water to drain out of that soil so those roots do not drown. We typically use perlite and pumice. Perlite and pumice, let me explain what pumice is first. Pumice is a volcanic rock. It's very light. It's full of air bubbles, gas bubbles. It's kind of it's airy and it can float. Pumice, being from volcanoes, you can mine it. It's organic. Pumice is fairly neutral. It's actually kind of like expanded glass. So it doesn't really affect the pH and it doesn't have any nutrients really to add to the system, which is good because it gives you that control. You want components that are somewhat neutral so that you could add the fertilizer, you being the grower, the horticulturist. So pumice is a main one. Now, if you take pumice and you put it in, you heat it up again and you pop it like popcorn, it turns into perlite. So perlite is the same thing, just lighter, a little bit more fluffy, and perlite can definitely float. And when you water your pot, you'll see it float to the top. So again, the job of that perlite is to add spaces for air to be in there and also for drainage. One thing to be careful with perlite, you always want to work with it when it's wet because the dust is bad for you. So don't inhale that dust. All right. So that's for your water and air drainage. All right. The next one is vermiculite. Actually, let me go back a bit. There are some other things to add drainage. Some people think about sand and gravel. Sand, I would not add because sand, unless it's mixed sizes, doesn't really create better drainage. Gravel does, but it's heavy. So again, we stick to lighter things, pumice and perlite. All right, now let's go to the next one. The opposite of perlite, something to hold water, like a sponge, would be vermiculite. Vermiculite expands and holds water, and that's going to be like a reservoir, not only for the water, but the nutrients in the water. Another ingredient that's commonly added to soil that does something similar is a binding type of agent, is your peat moss or cocoa coir. Cocoa coir or cocoa peat is ground up coconut shells, and peat moss is ground up peat. So you add that to the soil. Again, both of those things, not both, those things are very different. Let's talk about cocoa coir. Cocoa peat, cocoa coir, fairly neutral. It will decompose and it will raise the acidity of soil slowly, but it's a slow decomposing material. It's also fairly spongy, holding onto water, and it's going to bind the materials together and give that soil mix some body. Tilth, we call it, to hold the plant up. All right, now peat moss texturally does the same thing, but peat moss is very acidic, naturally acidic. So it's going to raise your pH of your soil no matter what you do because it's an acidic ingredient. Peat moss you want to use sparingly. It's very expensive. It's not a renewable resource because they have to drain bogs and things like that. They have to go get it. They have to go get this moss and basically mine it. So it might not be good for the environment. So we use a lot more cocoa peat. The next main ingredient we add to soils is compost. And the compost is some nutrients and also some biology. So those four main ingredients, perlite, vermiculite, peat mosses, whether it's cocoa peat or peat moss, and then compost, those four ingredients, plus water and air. Remember, all soil has water and air in it. Make up a soilless soil media. And it's soilless because there's no rocks in it. There's no parent material. There's no earth. I'm not digging up sand, silt, and clay and adding it into it, right? So it's a man-made thing. It's a media for growth. So that's what I want you to think about conceptually. Once we take plants out of pots and put them in the ground, sorry, take them out of the ground, excuse me, put them in pots, other way around, right? Those plants are no longer in the ground, they're in a container. They're going to be in a soil mix that is very different and it functions differently. If you were to just take a pot and fill it with soil from the earth and plant a plant in it, you might run into a lot of problems. The drainage might not work right. There might be too many minerals or not enough minerals. Usually the drainage is a big thing because the water draining through the different layers of the soil, those different layers work together to help that drainage. When they don't exist in a small pot, drainage gets all weird. So these soil-less soil mixes basically allow plants to grow under total control. The horticulturists, the nursery people that grow plants, they add the nutrients that the plants need. They basically spoon feed the plants to make the plants grow just right, just how they want them, at the speed and the size, flowering time. The horticulturist's job is to provide the nutrients. That potting media, that soilless potting soil, is there to hold the nutrients that are being added and also to provide water, adequate drainage, right, and adequate access to oxygen. So the soil is a media to hold the nutrients. Very similar to we talked about in tissue culture. Remember in cloning a plant, they put it in that rooting media, that gel, that agar. The agar itself doesn't have anything in it. They add nutrients and hormones into that agar, into that media to induce rooting. So it's similar to that with potting soil, soilless potting soil. We're making the soil to support the roots of the plant and to hold the nutrients that we will add. So we'll talk about fertilizing in a little bit too. And there's all sorts of different mixtures, different ratios. We will be making soil in lab. So we'll show you the different soil mixes that we have, how we make them. So remember that. Plants in containers are not planted in soil right out of the ground. Very rarely do you add any of that. And again, the major ingredients are peat mosses, cocoa peats, vermiculite, perlite, and pumice. Those are the main four ingredients. And there's some other things. There'll be pH adjusters and things like that. We'll go into those in more detail. The other main thing to consider about for planting media in containers is how much it weighs. And this is one reason why we use perlite versus pumice. So if you have a big pot, you may not want it to be super heavy. Likewise, though, if you have a little tiny pot, I like to use pumice because it does hold a small pot down. Anyhow, most soilless potting medias in containers also are really good for bottom watering. They're really good at wicking water from the bottom up using capillary action. You can still water from the top, but soilless potting media works great from bottom water. And bottom watering is good because it basically soaks from the bottom up. It gets all that soil moist, and then you seem to have a little bit more control. You can pour off the extra water from a tray or something, and then the plant just does better. The roots are deeper. Remember, if you have plants in pots indoors, if they're in a tray and that tray is full of water, right after the water's gone through the pot and it sits in the water, that means that whole soil is going to be moist until that water's gone, because that water is going to wick up into the soil ball until it's gone. So remember that. Again, don't overwater your plants. Many people overwater their plants just as much as underwater. All right, so there's soil mixes for everything, for all different types of plants. Some plants, like orchids and some of our tropical epiphytes, the plants that grow on other plants, they just need very coarse, chunky soil with lots of bark and moss, because that's kind of reminiscent of where they're growing on a tree trunk. Things like cactus and succulents, some of them like really gritty mixtures with lots of rocks and minerals and draining as well. Other things like my fruit trees in my big pots that I grow, I don't want them to drain really well, because then I'll be watering them all the time. So I actually plant them in a mix that has less perlite and pumice, more of the cocoa peat, more vermiculite in it, more compost, so it can hold more water. And I don't have to water as much. You have to also remember that these potting soils or soilless soil medias tend to be pretty airy, so they also affect the temperature of the root ball. Remember, colder temperatures mean slower activity, slower growth. Likewise, super hot temperatures can kill the roots. You have to be careful, because that if it's in a pot surrounded by the air, that soil is likely to come to the temperature of the air through conduction. So you want to be careful, especially with black nursery pots. They get really hot. So these are some of the things we consider about when we have uh, soilless mixes and containers. The other one is compaction. So when you're planting a plant in a pot, we want to use moist but not wet soil, and we want to pack that soil down, but we don't want to smash it down, and we don't want to compact it too hard. We want it just to be sturdy enough so the plant is steady, but we don't want to crush all the air pockets, right? We won't want to we want to leave some of those air pockets for drainage of water. This is also why super dry soil mix isn't good to use, because it doesn't hold things up. So just use a slightly moist soil mix when you're planting, not dripping wet, not bone dry, kind of in the middle. Pack it down so the plant is firm and steady, but don't go too much, or else you will uh, get rid of the air space, which is also water space. One thing we also learned is if you get things like not spider mites, gnats, and weird little bugs flying around your soil, two things are probably happening, most likely. One, you're probably overwatering, because they need moist conditions, really wet conditions to breed. And two, you might have too much organic matter in that soil. So like using too much compost or really chunky things like wood can cause fungus to develop, which is naturally normal and fine, perfect for the plants. But that's the food for the fungus gnats. So just remember, if you have a problem with fungus gnats, check your watering. Cover your soil surface. In the nursery, we use sand. We cover the soil surface with wash sand, and that works really well. And two, make sure that soil is either drying out between watering or is very airy and not stagnant, because that can make gnats, and gnats are no fun. What else about soils? Potting medias can be very expensive. You get what you pay for. So if you really want to grow good plants in containers and pots, you're going to need good soil, and that can be expensive, just like anything. So when we make our soil, we'll show you the ingredients. We don't buy soil in anymore. We used to buy all our soils prepackaged. We used Unigrow, which is a great company, but the price is a little high, especially nowadays on mixed soil. So it's cheaper for us to buy the ingredients bulk and individually, and then custom blend. That also gives us more control. As horticulturists, we like control over what we're growing and how we're going to grow it. So we have like native California native plant mix, native California seed mix, house plant mix, vegetable mix, right? We have all sorts of different cactus and succulent mix. And that's good, because you don't want to just use the same soil for everything. You want to have some customization. Because soil is expensive, though, we do recycle it. And in order to do this safely and effectively, it has to be sterilized. And we sterilize the soil when we make it. So not only is our soil mix sterilized before plants go into it, any used soil is also sterilized. And this is going to limit diseases and weeds, right? Kill the weed seeds. We steam sterilize our soil in a cubic, it makes 1 cubic yard sterilizer that makes a cubic yard of soil. And it's an electric, basically, it's a metal box that heats up with electricity and it gets you wet. You put moist soil in there and the water turns to steam, and there you go. Fairly expensive and clunky, but it does work. We also use cement mixers and professional soil mixers to mix the soil so that we're not, shoveling it, contaminating it, or putting it on the ground like in the old days, mixing on the ground. We are very careful to make sure our soil mix stays sterile. Likewise, soil biology, not going to be a lot in there. Even if you add bacteria and fungi inoculants, they might not be that happy. So what we like to do is add teas, like compost tea. We literally take compost, we run water through it. That water is black or brown like coffee. We use that liquid as a fertilizer. And that liquid has the fungi and the bacteria and all the different exudates of those organisms that the plants like. So you can make compost teas and water your plants with them instead of adding more compost to that soil. Just add the tea to it. You can also add things like worm castings, which are really good. And worm castings, you can add like a powder on the top of the soil. They kind of dissolve in, and that will also bring the exudates of the worms, which will make that soil more bacterially alive and more functional for the plants. All right, the other thing I want to talk about is your pot, your style of your pot and how that relates to the soil in there. Plastic and ceramic pots are more likely to hold moisture, ceramic being like a shiny, glossy surface. They hold the moisture in there. So for my desert students, this is a great thing. I love ceramic pots. They're heavy, and I like plastic pots because they're light, but they hold in that moisture. So if you have a dry condition, that might be better for you than a clay pot. Clay pots tend to breathe, and they don't hold as much water, and they actually have more air. So the root balls in clay pots dry out more. You might want that depending on your growing conditions. So remember, these different things, clay pots, plastic pots, terracotta pots, they have their purpose for different growing conditions. So if you're in a really wet area, you might be better off with terracotta. In a very dry area, you might be better with plastic or ceramic. Now, we're not in a very cold area, so if you did live in a very cold area, I know ceramic pots survive freezing and are less prone to cracking than terracotta. But you can use them both, and we do use them both, depending on what plants we're growing in the container. We like if you, for example, in a nursery condition where you're growing tons of plants, clay pots and ceramic pots are going to be a little too expensive and too heavy. So they're going to be using plastic. So if you want a plant that needs a lot of air in the root ball and you're going to go plastic pots, they do make special plastic pots that have lots of holes in them that allow root pruning through air, basically air pruning. And some plants love that. And you don't have to have a bunch of heavy terracotta pots. What else can we talk about soil and our things? Sometimes a media is like a moss, like a peat moss, not a ground peat moss, but like live peat moss or sphagnum moss, which looks like green moss. That is a growing media for many plants. So sometimes we just plant directly into moistened peat moss, moistened sphagnum moss, and there's very little soil in there. There might be chunks of bark or whatnot. And likewise, some of our cacti are planted in almost just pure pumice with just a little bit of compost in there. And that's, again, to keep them from rotting and having issues with too much water. Now, raised beds. Interesting. So raised beds are kind of between soil and potting media. It also depends how big the raised beds are. So if your raised beds are deeper than 20 inches or are bigger than, I would say, a cubic yard of soil, you will have a heavier mix to hold more moisture in there. Um, you could have that. Now, also, if you're trying to, you don't want the weight, you're going to have to stick with the lighter mix. But you can treat raised beds just like large pots. The only exception is I would suggest adding a little bit more compost and maybe some topsoil to raised beds that are attached to the ground. So if the raised bed is on earth, you can go ahead and add some topsoil and some more earthy materials in there to actually make it more of a true soil than a soilless soil mix. However, if those raised beds are closed off from the soil, just stick with the soilless soil mix, and you'll be happier. And you can actually mulch with compost and fertilize like normally, and the plants will function better. Okay, other media that we're going to be dealing with. We're going to be looking at hydroponics, and we're going to plant some plants in the hydroponic setup. Hydroponics, the media is water, and the water is bringing the nutrients. Now we're going to plant. Ours kind of has a double media. Our plants are being held up in pots by something called hydroton, which are little clay pebbles. And again, those clay pebbles don't do anything. All they do is literally hold the plant up. The water moving through those pebbles and through the system is what's providing all the nutrients the plants need. So you'll see those like cocoa pebbles. They don't provide any nutrients. Likewise, in our aquaponics, again, the water is the media, and all the nutrients there are coming from the fish. In hydroponics, we're adding all the nutrients. But in aquaponics, there's this system of nitrification through the fish using the water and their excrement and all sorts of stuff. So we'll see that as well in lab tomorrow and do a little lab there. All right, so this short little lecture was about soil mixes, not in the ground, because we're going to do that later. So we're going to be making soil in class, and we're going to compare different types of mixes together and do a little bit of an experiment and see how they work. All right, thank you so much.